Heather and I began discussing COVID as biologists on DarkHorse, and it resulted in us quickly becoming demonetized by YouTube, which they've never reversed, even though they were wrong on the substance of what they complained about. And we feel their thumb, or the thumb of whatever it is that guides YouTube, their thumb is still on the scale, not only at YouTube, but we feel it at Twitter. And I don't think that's Musk's doing. I think there's something deeply embedded in his machine that still would like to keep us from reaching an audience, even though we've been vindicated across the board with respect to what we understood. But in any case,
deep corporate is the counterpart to the deep state. I think it exists. It's part of this managerial bureaucracy that spans the public sector, the private sector, the associate deans of God knows what at universities. It's a separate kind of DNA and a different kind of gene pool.
It is the wholesale capture of every structure on which we depend. There seems to be not a single institution that has been able to resist this. The only thing that resists it are small numbers of individuals who are not beholden to anyone. And so that does raise a question I do want to ask you. I don't know your position either during the so-called pandemic or your position now on what happened during the pandemic, but as somebody who had his life turned completely upside down over these issues, I am very interested in what you thought and what you think now and how it would affect your power in governance if you did make it to the presidency.
Yeah. So I think that the virus originated in a lab in Wuhan, China. It was engineered, and it was engineered by a form of research, gain-of-function research, that was banned here in the United States, but was nonetheless funded in part using U.S. taxpayer dollars because of the rogue behavior of U.S. government actors in the deep state who disagreed with that policy. And taxpayer dollars and the law be damned, funded it anyway, under the excuse of preventing a global pandemic that gave us a global pandemic instead. Then they funded and uses taxpayer dollars again to fund the creation of vaccines to prevent the spread of that pandemic in the name of helping the health of a general population that ended up covering up many of the health risks associated with that vaccine. It happened by no coincidence to be some of the very same actors that literally funded the creation of the pandemic that then went on to fund the creation of the vaccines, again, dressed up in the garb of helping humanity, did not help humanity in the way that they professed to. And then we see the rise of a policy response that, in the name of helping humanity, made all kinds of mistakes that leave us worse off even along the very health axes: depression, anxiety, education of our children, obesity, diabetes, cancer treatment, and so on, that are net worse on health axes alone, let alone economic axes, just health axes alone, than they otherwise would have been had we not adopted those policies. Yet, the very companies that were able to censor any debate about those policies were the principal beneficiaries financially of those policies. That includes most of the Silicon Valley establishment. So I could probably go on for hours, but in summary, that is roughly what I think is some of the most useful parts that we could actually learn lessons from to stop us from making the same mistakes again, as I otherwise predict we're well on track to with respect to the culture of the climate, the cult of the climate, that I think is in the early stages of on track of repeating the mistakes of the COVID biosecurity state. I think we're now approaching the beginnings of a climate security state that's going to repeat every one of those same mistakes, lock, stock, and barrel, in their new form.
Excellent. Well, you did spectacularly well from my perspective, having watched and participated in the battle over COVID. There are a couple points I would add to your list going forward. the hardest nut to crack in all of the COVID landscape has been the question of early treatment with repurposed drugs, where a large number of people who have figured out that the vaccines were not safe nor effective still believe the propaganda that they were fed over early treatment with repurposed drugs. That's a very deep rabbit hole, because there is a reason that the propaganda was so aggressive with respect to this issue. In other words, the release of the vaccines required there not to be an alternative for the EUAs to be granted. So that is, in my opinion, the reason that this has been the hardest of these to clear up. But anyway, it's worth looking into what actually took place with respect to repurposed drugs. And also, if hydroxychloroquine and ivermectin are their own can of worms. But even just the failure to recommend vitamin D for a population that is well understood to be vitamin D deficient, and the massive increase in health that could have been achieved relative to COVID if we had been honest about exposure to sun, and if you can't get enough exposure to sun, supplementation with vitamin D. That was a tremendous missed opportunity, and a very frightening absence from the recommendations, because it literally, to the extent that there are side effects to vitamin D, they would have been positive, right? It's an amazing thing for us to have missed. The other thing that I didn't hear in your description was the role that our vaccination campaign likely played in the evolution of viral variants. In other words, did we produce an ongoing pandemic?
Of course we did, though.
Yeah.
By definition, right? Because and I think that's actually deeply related to it being a man-made virus in the first place. Of course, this gets into the attributes of the way in which attributes of a man-made virus that did not naturally evolve in nature themselves create risk of variants that were of a different way of, let's just say microevolutionary change that's different of a kind than you had from one that originated in nature.
Right. And, you have an
antigenic shift versus drift and so on. Yeah.
Yeah. You have an engineered virus that one should not expect to abide by the same rules that a natural spillover event would have produced. And then you have an absurdly narrow so-called vaccine that creates an evolutionary signal that is so targeted that, of course, natural selection would overcome any benefit from these vaccines, because the vaccines are just simply not broad enough to create a difficult puzzle to solve, right? Selection is very good at solving a puzzle, and with a single antigen, that was guaranteed. But the last thing I would say is, a couple weeks ago, Heather and I were prone to look at the COVID response in light of the Nuremberg Code, which I'm embarrassed to say I had not gone back and reread since COVID began. I knew that our vaccine campaign in particular was a violation, because informed consent was breached twice, right? Couldn't possibly be informed if they were censoring viewpoints, right? You were misinformed. And it wasn't a matter of consent because we were coerced. But when we went back and looked at the provisions of the Nuremberg Code, I was surprised to discover that we appear to have violated every single one of them.
Interesting.
These are provisions about which in 1947, even though they had not yet been codified, 7 doctors were hanged on the basis that we had violated, or that they had violated, this obvious principle derived from the Hippocratic Oath. So in any case, I do believe that this is another one of these examples of something that, if you stand in the right place and you look back at our COVID response, it's so clear that what happened wasn't just wrong, but it was an egregious violation of a central principle of medicine, and not even modern medicine, but
totally
stretching way back, that it's worth looking at it through that lens.
I agree with you. I think the fact that there's people like you who also now are not going to let this just go gently into the night, but make sure we learn these lessons, is vitally important for actually our best way of preventing making that same mistake in the future, would it be a global pandemic or even what I think is increasingly made up change of existential threat of global climate change. And I'm with you on that. I think that we're just at the beginnings of uncovering all of the sins that were committed under COVID, some of which were intentional. I think some of this is being attributed to incompetence, I think is too charitable. And I think that without actual accountability for some of the individuals who actually committed the most offensive of the sins, who are now being, by the way, invited as commencement speakers this spring at prominent medical schools.
Oh, God.
I think that without accountability, including potential criminal penalties, we're going to put ourselves at risk of making those same mistakes again.
Yeah. I would also say, even if COVID and medical, I agree with you. This can't possibly have been incompetence, because incompetence can get you to a effectively random response. It can't get you to the inverse of a correct response. And in this case, we did almost the inverse of everything we should have done.
To a T.
Right.
To a T.
So, but I also think even just the exercise of going back and figuring out how our response to COVID happened is probably the best chance we're ever going to get to understand the corruption of our system, because it really does reveal the connections between the broken governmental response, the universities and university science, journalism, the tech sector, all of these things. Their connections are revealed by this story. And so, no, I'm not going to let it go, because I think it's very important that we use it to diagnose the illness that our system has and to cure it. And it sounds like you are on a similar page, which I greatly appreciate.
Amen, my man. I am. It's probably the most enjoyable conversation I've had in a little while.
Awesome. I'm pleased to hear that.